The Irresistible Revolution, Living as an Ordinary Radical by Shane Claiborne, Chapter 5. Another way of doing life. If you ask most people what Christians believe, they can tell you. Christians believe that Jesus is God's Son and that Jesus rose from the dead. But if you ask the average person how Christians live, they are struck silent. We have not shown the world another way of doing life. Christians pretty much live like everybody else. They just sprinkle a little Jesus along the way. And doctrine is not very attractive. Even if it's true, few people are interested in a religion that has nothing to say to the world and offers them only life after death, when what people are really wondering is whether there is life before death. As my teacher Tony Campallo used to ask, even if there were no heaven and there were no hell, would you still follow Jesus? Would you follow him for life, joy, and fulfillment he gives you right now? I am more and more convinced each day that I would. Don't get me wrong, I'm excited about the afterlife. We are going to party like there's no tomorrow, and there won't be. And yet I'm convinced that Jesus came not just to prepare us to die, but to teach us how to live. Otherwise, much of Jesus' wisdom would prove quite unnecessary for the afterlife. After all, how hard could it be to love our enemies in heaven? And the kingdom that Jesus speaks so much about is not just something we hope for after we die, but is something we are to incarnate now. Jesus says the kingdom is within us, among us, at hand, and we are to pray that it comes on earth as it is in heaven. No wonder the early Christian church was known as the Way. It was a way of life that stood in glaring contrast to the world. What gave the early Christians integrity was the fact that they could denounce the empire in the same breath, say, and we have another way of living. If you are tired of what the empire has to offer, we invite you into the way. Even the pagan emperors could not ignore the little revolution of love. Emperor Julian confessed, "The godless Galileans feed our poor in addition to their own." And the way had little cells multiplying all over the old empire. Of course, everyone was forewarned that in this kingdom everything is backward and upside down. The last are first, and the first are last. The poor are blessed, and the mighty are cast from their thrones. And yet people were attracted to it. They were ready for something different from what the empire had to offer. Coming out of college, my friends and I were pretty unwilling to conform to the pattern of this world. As the scriptures say, Romans 12 verse 2, we knew all too well that there is a broad way that leads to death, and that most people would take it. But we also knew that there is a narrow way that leads to life, and we wanted to find it. Matthew 7:13-14. In fact, people had gone to notice the ripples from our little student movement. I was asked to speak at Eastern graduation ceremony, and to chagrin of the dean, I told the story of how some friends and I were busted for rappelling out of the window of one of the dorms. The dean had written us a warning that said, "Can you please enter and exit the building through the doors like everybody else?" So my graduation message, crawled through the window, went something like this: the doors of normalcy and conformity are dead. The time has come to give up on the doors and find a window to climb through. It's a little more dangerous and may get you into some trouble, but it is a heck of a lot more fun. And the people who have changed the world have always been risk takers who climb through windows, while the rest of the world just walk in and out of doors. It got quite an ovation from everyone, but the dean, we were ready for something new. An experiment in truth. My friends and I had a hunch that there is more to life than what we have been told to pursue. We knew that the world could not afford the American dream, and that the good news is that there is another dream. We looked to the early church and to the scriptures and to the poor to find it. When Dorothy Day recalls the beginnings of the Catholic worker movement, she says very unassumingly, "We were just there talking and it happened. We were just there talking and people moved in. We were just there talking and the lines began to form." The last line of her autobiography is, "It all happened while we sat there talking, and it is still going on." I know what she meant. So about 30 of us from the Eastern College continued dreaming together about another way of doing life. We stayed up night after night laughing and arguing, and eventually we came to the point where we knew we would never agree on exactly what causes homosexuality or whether Adam had a belly button. Some things are best left unresolved. So we decided to go ahead and give our vision a shot. Besides, most of us were getting tired of talking and were ready to live. And I was living in a van, yes, down by the river. So we started looking for houses. One of the first things we did was mail our letters to share stories and needs with large cloud of supporters surrounding us. One of our first newsletters put it this way: once there was a small group of kids who decided to go to a park in the middle of the city and dance and play, laugh and twirl. As they played in the park, they thought that maybe another child would pass by and see them. Maybe that child would think it looked fun and decided to join them. Then maybe another one would. Then maybe a businessman would hear them from a skyscraper. Maybe he would look out the window. Maybe he would see them playing and lay down his papers and come down. Maybe they could teach him to dance. Then maybe another businessman would walk by, a nostalgic man, and he would take off his tie and toss aside his briefcase and dance and play. Maybe the whole city would join the dance. Maybe even the world. Maybe, regardless, they decided to join the dance. Poet Henry David Thoreau went to the woods because he wanted to live deliberately, to breathe deeply, and to suck out the marrow of life. We went to the ghetto. We narrowed our vision to this: love God, love people, and follow Jesus. And we began calling our little experiment the simple way. In January 1997, 6 of us moved into a little row house in Kensington, one of Pennsylvania's poorest neighborhoods, just minutes from Old St. Edward's Cathedral. I felt like we were reinventing the early church for the first time in 2,000 years. We were quite ignorant. We had no idea what we were getting into. We had no big vision for programs or community development. We wanted only to be passionate lovers of God and people and to take the gospel way of life seriously. Some of us dropped out of school, some finished. Some of us were pursuing careers, others left them. People sometimes asked us what we do all day on an average day, at the simple way. And my answer has always been real short. Either nothing spectacular or what is an average day. It gets a little crazy since our lives are full of surprises and interruptions. I'll do my best to describe to you. We hang out with kids and help them with homework in our living room and jump in open fire hydrants on hot summer days. We share food with folks who need it and eat the beans and rice of neighborhoods Miss Sunshine makes for us. Folks drop in all day to say hi, have a place to cry, or get some water or a blanket. Sometimes we turn people away or play rock, paper, scissors to see who answers the door or on tired days. We run a community store out of our house. We call it the gathering, and neighbors can come in and fill a grocery bag with clothes for $1 or find a couch, a bed, or a refrigerator. Sometimes people donate beautiful things for us to share with our neighbors. Other times we donate their used toothbrushes. We reclaimed abandoned lots and make gardens amid the concrete wreckage around us. We plant flowers inside old TV screens and computer monitors on our roof. We see our friends waste away from drug addiction, and on a good day, someone is set free. We see police scare people, and on a good day, we find officers who will play wiffle ball with his billy club. We rehab abandoned houses. We mourn the people who died in property where I'm now writing. We try to make ugly things beautiful and to make murals. Instead of violence, we learn imagination and sharing. We share life with our neighbors and try to take care of each other. We hang out on the streets. We get fined for distributing food. We go to jail for sleeping under stars. We win in court. We have friends in prison and on death row. We stand in the way of state-sanctioned execution and of the prison industrial complex. We have always called ourselves tax-exempt, 501c3, anti-profit organization. We wrestle to free ourselves from macro charity and distant acts of charity that serve to legitimize apathetic lifestyles of good intentions but rob us of the gift of community. We visit rich people and have them visit us. We preach, prophesy, and dream together about how to awaken the church from her violent slumber. Sometimes we speak to change the world. Other times we speak to keep the world from changing us. We are about ending poverty, not simply managing it. We give people fish. We teach them to fish. We tear down the walls that have been built up around the fish pond, and we figure out who polluted it. We fight terrorism, the terrorism within each of us, the terrorism of corporate greed, of American consumption, of war. We are not pacifist hippies, but passionate lovers who abhor passivity and violence. We spend our lives actively resisting everything that destroys life, whether that be terrorism or the war on terrorism. We try to make the world safe, knowing that the world will never be safe as long as millions live in poverty, so the few can live as they wish. We believe in another way of life, the kingdom of God, which stands in opposition to principalities, powers, and rulers of the dark world, Ephesians 6:12. So that's an average day. Since those early days, we've made plenty of mistakes and have never learned the secret to not hurting each other. We have begun asking new questions and have challenged each other how to risk more. Some of the faces have changed, and some of us are still here. Now some of us are married, and some of us have chosen singleness, and some have kids. We recognize each of these choices as a gift. We have created some healthy structures and rhythms for our communal life, such as our Sabbath and our modified common pool of money, to which we contribute $150 for living expenses each month. We have described the layers of our common life as an onion, at the core of which are partners who covenant to love and cherish each other. The hardest part and most beautiful thing we do, and each of us shares healthy responsibility and expectations. We've hashed out our negotiables and tried to understand those who do not agree with. We have created a statement of our faith so folks know we are not a cult, and so folks will know we are not just believers. We have created a statement of our practices, which range from simplicity and nonviolence to beauty and play. New folks have brought energy and imagination, and we've seen new visions born, from circuses and theater camps to superheroes and new monasticism. Our program revolve around the needs and gifts in our community and are always changing. They never define us, for we set out to not to start programs, but simply to be good neighbors. Neighbors have come and gone over the past decade. So sometimes we are feeding 50 folks of our kitchen, helping dozens of kids with homework, fixing up abandoned houses, or planting urban gardens. In the summers, we are running collaborative art camps with the Yes and theater company, mixing suburb and urban kids and carving out space for imagination and dreams. The kids create dance, music, art, characters, a set, and build a show together. We now have so many partners in the community and organizations that it really feels like a movement much bigger than the simple way. And we are just one little cell within the body, very full of life, but only a small part of the whole. Cells are born and cells die, but bodies live forever, shouting the gospel with our lives. Remembering the invitation that Mother Teresa always gave to the curious seekers, we have from the beginnings invited people to come and see, and people have hundreds. As evangelical, the only way I know to invite people into Christian faith is to come and see. After all, I'm not just trying to get someone to sign a doctrinal statement, but to come and know love, grace, and peace in the incarnation of Jesus, and now in the incarnation of the body, Christ Church. So if anyone asked me to introduce them to Jesus, I would say, come and see. Let me show you Jesus with skin on. Sometimes we have evangelicals, usually from the suburbs, who pretentiously ask how we evangelize people. I usually tell them we bring folks like them here to learn the kingdom of God from the poor, and send them to tell the rich and powerful there is another way of life being born in the margins. For Jesus did not seek out the rich and powerful in order to trickle down his kingdom. Rather, he joined those at the bottom, the outcasts and undesirables, and everyone who attracted to his love for people on the margins. We know that we are all poor and lonely anyway, don't we? Then we invited everyone into a journey of downward mobility to become the least. As the old Franciscan slogan goes, preach the gospel always, and when necessary, use words. Or, as our 70-year-old revolutionary Catholic nun, Sister Margaret, puts it, we are trying to shout the gospel with our lives. Many spiritual seekers have not been able to hear the words of Christians because the lives of Christians have been making so much horrible noise. It can be hard to hear the gentle whisper of the Spirit amid the noise of Christendom. A voice for the voiceless, not us. Not too long ago, those of us at the Simple Way were about to speak before a congregation. The people doing the introduction said, "These folks are a voice for the voiceless." And something inside me hurt. I gently corrected them. Everyone has a voice. I know many amazing people have used the old voice for the voiceless line, Oscar Romero, Mother Teresa, and even a book of Proverbs. But it just felt strange. Perhaps we are too quick to assume folks cannot speak for themselves. We are not a voice for the voiceless. The truth is that there is a lot of noise out there drowning out quiet voices, and many people have stopped listening to the cries of their neighbors. Lots of folks have put their hands over their ears to drown out suffering. Institutions have distanced themselves from disturbing cries. When Paul writes in Romans 8 that the entire creation is groaning for its liberation, he goes on to say, we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly, verse 23. This is the chorus of generations of seemingly voiceless people that have joined, and God has a special ear for their groaning regardless of who else is listening. It is a beautiful thing when folks in poverty are no longer just a missions project, but become genuinely friends and family with whom we laugh, cry, dream, and struggle. One of the verses I have grown to love is the one where Jesus is preparing to leave the disciples and says, I no longer call you servants. Instead, I've called you friends. John 15:15. Servanthood is a fine place to begin, but gradually we move forward to mutual love, genuine relationships. Someday, perhaps, we can even say those words that Ruth said to Naomi after years of partnership. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I'll be buried. Ruth 1:16-17. And that's when things get messy, when people begin moving beyond charity and toward justice and solidarity with the poor and the oppressed, as Jesus did. They get in trouble. Once we are actually friends with folks who struggle, we start to ask why people are poor, which is never as popular as giving to charity. One of my friends has a shirt marked with the words of the late Catholic Bishop Dom Helder Camara. When I fed the hungry, they called me a saint. When I asked why people are hungry, they called me a communist. Charity wins awards and applause, but joining to the poor gets you killed. People do not get crucified for charity. People are crucified for living out a love that disrupts the social order that calls forth the new world. People are not crucified for helping the poor people. People are crucified for joining them. Ordinary radicals. Sometimes people call those of us in our community radical. As I said before, if by radical we mean roots, I think it is precisely the right word for what we are trying to do. Get down to the roots of what it means to be Christian disciples. Most of the time, though, I think that if we are doing what we are doing seems radical, then that says more about the apathy of Western Christianity than about the true nature of discipleship. And this is why radical has to be coupled with ordinary. Our way of life was typical in the days of early Jesus movement. We are like the martyrs and Marthas, Mary's and Martha's and Peter's family, house of hospitality, which was the standard call of the early Christians who abandoned their personal possessions to a new family. This is to say nothing of countless others who gave up everything and left their homes with no money or food or even sandals to follow Jesus. Christendom seems very unprepared for people who take the gospel that seriously. One of the things that fascinated me about the days of the early church is how those who abandoned homes and possessions to follow Jesus lived in such union with those who opened their homes to them and the poor. Gerard Thiessen calls the two groups the wandering charismatics and the local sympathizers. The wanderers were traveling apostles and relied on the support of sympathizers. Both shaped the early church. They did not look down on each other. Sympathizers did not write wanderers off as radicals or freaks, and the wanderers did not judge the sympathizers as sellouts. They loved and supported one another. From our earliest days, we have seen the importance of the partnership we have commissioned. Wanderers and nomads who travel like the apostles did, or like later circuit riders of the church who traveled on horseback, which is a little harder nowadays. These new pilgrims help to pollinate our communities and lives. We have had folks travel the countryside by bike, by car, on foot, using biodiesel, and by RV, seeking to intersect our lives in the Christian underground. I finished this chapter traveling on a bus that has converted diesel engine that runs on used vegetable oil. We just hit up restaurants for their old oil and busted out a little circus, www.runawaycircus.org, to earn our dinner. Some folks, like our sister community, Salters, live permanently nomadic lives. Last month, with the full support of Sacred Heart Parish in Camden, we just commissioned another brother to travel across the U.S. by bike, spreading the news of what was happening in Camden and Philly and bringing back stories of people he meets. He went out with nothing but faith in his bike, dependent on God's providence and the church hospitality. Despecularizing things. Again, it is easy to see these things as spectacular, but I really believe that only because we live in the world that has lost its imagination. These things were normal in the early church. It's just what conversion looked like. We must be careful not to allow ourselves to be written off as radicals when church history and contemporary Christian landscapes are filled with ordinary radicals. But today, people crave the spectacular. People are drawn to lights and celebrities, to arenas and megachurches. In the desert, Jesus was tempted by the spectacular, to throw himself from the temple so that people might believe, to shock and awe people, if you will. Today, the church is tempted by spectacular, to do big, miraculous things so people might believe. But Jesus has called us to littleness and compares our revolution to the little mustard seed, to yeast making its way through dough, slowly infecting this dark world with love. Many of us who find ourselves living differently from dominant culture end up needing to despectacularize things as little so that the simple way is made as acceptable as possible to ordinary radicals. Sometimes people call folks here the simple way saints. Usually they either went to applaud our lives and live vicariously through us, or they want to write us off as superhuman and create a safe distance. One of my favorite quotes written on my wall here is bold black marker, is from Dorothy Day. Don't call us saints. We don't want to be dismayed that easily. The truth is that when people look at us like we are sacrificial servants, I have to laugh. We've just fallen in love with God and our neighbors, and that is transforming our lives. Besides, I think if most other folks knew Adrienne and the kids, a beautiful family that has been living with us coming out from shelter system, they do the same thing we are doing. It just makes sense not to have families on the street or abandoned in houses, especially when we have a spare room. Honestly, the way of life we have chosen often seems more natural than the alternative. The alternative, moving out and living suburbs, seems terribly sacrificial or painfully empty. What must it be like to not have block parties or not to actually know the people around us? There are times when I have been very frustrated with wealthy folks for hoarding their stuff. But now I know enough rich folks to know that the loneliness that is all too familiar to many of them. I read a study comparing the health of a society with its economics, and one of the things I revealed is that the wealthy countries like ours have the highest rates of depression, suicide, and loneliness. We are the richest and most miserable people in the world. I feel sorry that so many of us have settled for a lonely world of independence and riches that we could all experience the fullness of life in community and interdependence. Why would I want a fancy car when I can ride a bike, or a TV when I can play outside with sidewalk chalk? Okay, sometimes I still want the hot tub on the roof, but the rest I can live without. And I mean live without. Patting Mother Teresa on the back, someone said to her, "I wouldn't do what you've done for $1 million, she said with a grin. Me neither. I almost feel selfish sometimes for the gift of community. The beautiful thing is that there is enough to go around. Once we get past the rebellious or reactive countercultural paradigm and muster up the courage to try living in new ways, most of us find that community is very natural and makes a lot of sense, and that it is not as foreign to most of us as the world population it is to us. Community is what we are created for. We are made for the image of God, who is community, a plurality of oneness. When the first humans was made, things were not good until there were two helping one another. The Bible story is the story of community from beginning to end. Jesus lived and modeled community with his little band of disciples. He always sent them out in pairs, and the early church is the story of a people who gathered together and were of one heart and mind, sharing all in common. The story ends with a vision of the new community in a book of Revelation where the city of God is dressed beautifully for her lover. This community called the New Jerusalem, where heaven visits earth and people are fully reconciled to God and each other. The lion lays down with the lamb. Mourning turns into dancing, and the garden takes over the concrete world. But that doesn't mean community isn't easy, for everything in this world tries to pull us away from community, pushes us to choosing ourselves over others, to choose interdependence over interdependence, independence over interdependence, to choose great things over small things, to choose going fast alone over going far together. The simple way is not the easy way. No one ever promised us that community or Christian discipleship would be easy. There's a commonly mistranslated verse where Jesus tells the disciples, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for my yoke is good and my burden is light." People take that to mean that if they were to come to Jesus, everything will be easy. The word good is often mistranslated as easy. Ha, that's funny. My life was pretty easy before I met Jesus. In one sense, the load is lighter because we carry the burdens of the world together. But he is still telling us to pick up a yoke. Yoke had a lot of different meanings. It was the tool used for harnessing animals for farming. It was the word used for taking on rabbis' teaching, as Jesus seems to use it here. Yoke was also the word used for the brutal weight of slavery and the oppression that prophets call us to break. Isaiah 58, among other passages. One of the things I think Jesus is doing is settling us from the free, heavy yoke of oppressive way of life. I know plenty of people, both rich and poor, who are suffocating from the weight of the American dream, who find themselves heavily burdened by the lifeless toil and consumption we put on ourselves. This is the yoke we are being set free from. The new yoke is still not easy. It's a cross, for heaven's sake. But we carry it together. It is good and it leads us to rest, especially for the weariest traveler. In fact, if we live our lives easy, we must be doing something wrong. Mama T always used to say, following Jesus is simple but not easy. Love until it hurts, and then love more. My friend Brooke, with whom I went to India and later started the Simple Way, used to have the words simple but not easy painted on her wall. And at one point, when things were particularly difficult, I graffitied over them, changing it to simple and hard as crude. Dorothy Day of the Catholic Worker Movement understood this well. She said, "Love is a harsh and dreadful thing to ask of us, but it is the only answer." This love is not sentimental, but heart-wrenching, the most difficult and the most beautiful thing in the world. A different kind of tax collector. We've been very careful at the Simple Way never to claim that we have the corner on the market for radical Christianity, nor have we tried to spread a brand or model. And the incredible thing is that the stories of ordinary radicals are all over the place. Stories of everyday people doing small things with great love, with their lives, gifts, and careers. I heard about a group of massage therapists who spent their days washing and massaging the tired feet of homeless folks. Sub-manicurists told me they go to old folks' homes and ask which old ladies have no visitors or family. And then they sit with them, laugh, tell stories, and do their nails. On some of the marches for peace and justice, chiropractors join us in the evenings to take care of people's tired bodies so that we will be ready for another day of marching. Around the corner from us, our close friends at the House of Grace Catholic Worker run a free clinic where nurses, doctors, chiropractors, and dentists care for folks who do not have health care. There are lawyers who bail us out of jail, advocate for human rights, and go with us before zoning boards that have no categories for understanding how we live. The examples are as numerous as the number of vocations, but the calling is the same, to love God and our neighbors with our whole lives, careers, and gifts. In the early days of our community, it was as if we had a radical disciple mold, and everyone had to fit into it. But as we have matured, maybe aged in wisdom, we have seen beauty in a diverse vocations and the multi-dimensionality of Christian discipleship. One of the best things communities like ours do is carve out space for people to discern and redefine their vocations. Vocation comes from the same root as voice, denoting the hearing of the divine call. Beyond knowing that God has a purpose for our lives, most of us, especially non-Catholics, spend little energy seeking our vocation, especially in light of how the needs and sufferings of our neighbors might inform how we use our gifts for divine purposes. There are plenty of people who are miserable in their jobs, for they have not listened to God's call. And I would add there are many Christians who are not fulfilled in their spiritual lives because they have no sense of their gifts or purpose, and they just run the mission field to save souls rather than transforming lives and communities using their gifts and those of the people they live among. Both lead to emptiness and burnout. The concepts of multidimensional discipleship is essential as we consider how to retain a radical discipleship that is multi-ethnic, intergenerational, and includes singles and families. Otherwise, we will just end up surrounded by people who look like us, think like us, and respond to the gospel in exactly the same way we do. And that would rob us of a gift community and of what it means to be a body with many different parts. What an extraordinary thing it must have been to sit around a table with that eclectic mix of zealous revolutionaries, Roman tax collectors, peasants, Samaritans, prostitutes, and fishermen, all conspiring to find a radical new way of life. In the early church, whenever converts sought baptism, their entire careers were reimagined, just as baptism was a symbol of people's dying to their old lives and rising to new ones. So there was the very real sense that the old way of living were gone and something was new here. For some, like the tax collector, Zacchaeus, whom Jesus calls down from the sycamore tree, where we had climbed up to see Jesus from a safe distance, the face-to-face encounter meant that his career was radically redefined, social, economically, and politically. He does not sell everything, but he sells half of everything, and then he pays people back 4 times what he owed them, enacting the ancient Levitical teaching of Jubilee, where debts are forgiven and possessions are redistributed. redistributed. We need some Jubilee tax collectors. Zacchaeus was still a tax collector, though he may have gone broke eventually, but now he was a different kind of tax collector. For others, the encounter with Jesus meant they needed to leave their jobs like another tax collector named Levi, Matthew. He meets Jesus and leaves it all behind, inviting his tax collector friends to join the movement. Some may leave their jobs, others will redefine them. When we truly encounter Jesus and the poor, we will still be a tax collector, but we will be a different kind of tax collector. We may still be a doctor, but we will be a different kind of doctor. Hippolytus, c.a.a.d. 218, said it like this in the 3rd century. The professions and trades of those who we are going to accept into the community must be examined. The nature and type of each must be established. Brothel, sculpture of idols, a charioteer, athlete, gladiator, give it up or be rejected. A military constable must be forbidden to kill, neither may he swear. If he is not willing to follow these instructions, he must be rejected. Proconsul or magistrate who wears the purple and governs by the sword shall give it up or be rejected. Anyone taking or already baptized who wants to become a soldier shall be sent away, for he has despised God. Many of us feel an inner collision between the old life and the new one. Our executive told me he sold his entire company and didn't even keep any of the money because it had only made him miserable. Another executive told me he was trying to implement a sliding scale wage based on family size that valued everyone equally, so the CEO was not making more money than the janitor or the receptionist. One friend in the military left because of his reborn identity and is now painting murals and preaching nonviolence with us here in Philly. It's sort of like you work for a porn shop and have a conversion experience. Most of us would probably agree it's a good idea to rethink your career track, but why wouldn't we do that for the born-again disciples? What if someone works for Lockheed Martin, the world's largest weapon contractor, or a notorious human rights abuser like Coca-Cola or Nestle or Disney or The Gap? We have had many people or professionals. Parents, economists, nurses, military officers come through our community and begin asking fresh questions about their vocation. What the voice of the Spirit is calling them to do with their lives. Not everyone responds exactly the same way. Some will give up their houses and leave their fields. Others will offer up their possessions to the community and form hospitality houses like Mary, Martha, and Peter's family. Others will hold back from the common pool and lie to God, and they will be struck dead like Ananias and Sapphira. Just kidding, hopefully. There are the Matthews who encounter Jesus and sell everything, but then there are also the Zacchaeuses who meet Jesus and refine their careers. So not everyone responds in the same way, but we must respond. We must seek our vocation, listening to the voice of God and the voices of our suffering neighbors. Both Zacchaeus and Matthew responded to the call of Jesus in radical ways that did not conform to the patterns of this world. Here in Philly, I have a friend named Atom. He is a scientist who uses big words and usually needs a translator, and he started working on his PhD when he was 21. Then he started hanging out with folks here at Simple Way and reading the Bible. His initial reaction was to leave everything, be a bike messenger, and pray all night. His mom recently introduced me to one of the people who messed up her son. But the more he sought God and his gifts, the more he felt his own vocation emerging. As he studied science in the context of his global neighborhood, he saw that the lack of access to clean water was the biggest killer of children in our world. Over 20,000 die each day from curable waterborne diseases. Economists predict that within the next decade, the leading cause of violence and war will not be oil but water. So Adam has decided much of his life to study and working with indigenous communities to solve this solvable crisis, and all hubbed out of a simple life of our block in inner Philly. A while later, Adam's sister Rachel joined us at the Simple Way. She had gone to one of the leading culinary schools in the country and worked at fancy restaurants downtown. She once sneaked Adam and me into $100 a plate dinner where we fit right in, stuffing our pockets full of food I cannot pronounce the name of. As she read the scriptures and hung out with friends in poverty, her gifts began to come to life. She made cookies with kids on the block and made fancy dinners with folks on the street. It's not every day our homeless friends get lobster. Both Adam and Rachel are ordinary radicals continuing to discern their vocations and spend their lives for others. Missionaries to the church. We have never really considered ourselves missionaries to the poor. Jesus was not simply a missionary to the poor. He was poor. Born a baby refugee from the Badlands of Nazareth, wandered the world a homeless rabbi, died the rotten death of insurrectionists and bandits on the cross, executed by the oppressive empire, buried in the burrowed tomb. Jesus was crucified not for helping the poor, but for joining them. That is the Jesus we follow. A pastor who has been a longtime supporter and friend of the Simple Way and father to one of the founders said, "I used to think you were all missionaries bringing the gospel to your neighborhood, but now I see that it is your neighborhood that you have learned the gospel and that you are actually missionaries to the church." Many of us are disenchanted Catholics and others are recovering evangelicals. When people used to ask me if I were a Protestant or Catholic, I was so discouraged with both that I would just answer, no, we are just followers of Jesus. Now as I thirst for God's church to be alive and one, when people ask me if I am Protestant or Catholic, I just answer yes. And when people ask me if there are evangelicals, I usually define it as I did in the introduction of this book and say, absolutely. We want to spread the kingdom of God like crazy. We have never considered ourselves a church plant. There are congregations on nearly every corner. I'm not sure we need more churches. What we really need is a church. I say one church is better than 50. I have tried to remove the plural from churches from my vocabulary, training myself to think of the church as Christ did, and as the early Christians did. The metaphor for her are always singular, a body, a bride. I heard one of the gospel preachers say it like this, as he really wound up and broke a sweat. We've got to unite ourselves as one body, because Jesus is coming back, and he's coming back for a bride, not a harem. So we worship in our neighborhood. A few of us attend Lutheran congregations, some Iglesia del Barrio, Church of the Neighborhood, which meets in an old, resurrected Methodist building. Many of us are covenanted at a Brethren in Christ cell church called Circle of Hope, where we have renovated 7,500 square foot abandoned warehouse and gather for our worship on Sunday evenings, which we just call PMs for public meetings. Just one small glimpse of what the church really is. Others are Catholic and go to Mass, and still others are not Catholic and go to Mass. We have done our homework club out of the Presbyterian building and have run an Episcopal after-school program. The Lutheran congregation put in showers so we can host larger overnight groups there. Some of us work at free clinic run by Catholic workers, and others with a partnered community committed to addiction recovery called New Jerusalem, and on and on. It feels like a body, a big family. Every few months we gather for nights of celebration or love feasts, when we eat some good grub, share stories and songs, and celebrate what God is doing among us. And once a year, we host our family reunion, which is an incredible gathering of activist theologians, new monastics, students, old friends, wanderers, revolutionaries, and regular old Christians, if there is such a thing. It is a beautiful organic web of cells within the body. We continually lift one another in prayer as Jesus prayed, asking that we would be one. one with the faithful disciples of the established church, one with faithful disciples of the underground church, and one with the ancient church of our past, one church. What the world really needs is not more churches, but a church. A culture of sorts. Anytime we make a radical conversion, there is the danger that people will say we are being brainwashed or joining a cult. The truth is, everyone in our culture has been deeply polluted by the noise and garbage of this world, and we all need to be washed clean. We need minds that are renewed and uncluttered so they are free to dream again. And let us not forget that the word cult comes from the same root from which we get our culture. So while we are not waiting for UFO landing, preparing for a mass suicide, or stockpiling weapons, we are forming an alternative culture. It is not simply a counterculture reacting to the dominant culture and getting marked by it. It won't be for long before you'll be able to buy gas masks for anti-war protests that are made by Lockheed Martin, or t-shirts that say "Make Poverty History" made by kids in sweatshops. We are forming a new culture, and in many ways it is broader and more sustainable, much less tribal than nationalism, and much less dangerous than the cult of civil religion that is infecting the church. And the imperial cult seems to be suspiciously closer to those infamous cults that stockpile weapons and await their suicidal fate, while pretentiously fortifying themselves against any truth that would set them free from the illusions that are killing them. Those cults who continue to offer blood sacrifices to gods of mammon and violence on the altars of desert sand and jungle soil. As a community, we have a doctrinal statement so folks know we are not drinking lamb's blood and sacrificing animals, except for the one stray cat that kept coming in. Just kidding. Most Christian congregations and communities have much a statement of faith articulating their orthodoxy, meaning right belief. But that's usually where it ends. For us, belief is only the beginning. What really matters is how we live, how what we believe gets fleshed out. So we also have a statement of orthopraxis, meaning right living, right practices. And this is where most believing-oriented faith communities fall short. They tell us only what they believe, but they do not tell us how their beliefs affect their lifestyles. In creating a new culture, we are now part of what we've come to call a community of communities, a web of relationships between grassroots organizations, intentional communities, and hospitality houses across the country. Many of them are older, and most are wiser than us, and some are just being born. Nearly everywhere I speak, small groups of young people come forward with fire in their eyes and say, "We have been dreaming the same dreams." A part of what we try to do is make the gospel way of life accessible as possible. One of the ways we have begun to understand what is happening is through the lens of ancient Christian monastic movements. During eras of history when the identity of Christian disciples became all but lost, the identity has always led small groups of people into exodus, into the wilderness, the desert, or the abandoned places within the empire. Our friends are at a sister community called Rekba House in North Carolina, organized a gathering devoted to creating a monastic rule of sorts, articulating the many common threads of belief and practice that we see the contemporary movement of the Spirit. It is not so much fleeing from something as dancing towards something new, building a new society in the shell of the old, as the Catholic workers say, creating a culture in which it is easier for people to be good. Schools for conversion. It is a shame that few conservative evangelicals have had a monopoly on the word conversion. Some of us shiver at the word, but conversion means to change, to alter, after which something looks different than it did before, like the conversion vans or converted currency. We need converts in the best sense of the word, people who are marked by renewing of their minds and imaginations, who no longer conform to the pattern of this destroying our world. Otherwise, we have only believers, and believers are a dime a dozen nowadays. What the world needs is people who believe so much in another world that they cannot help but begin enacting it now. Then we will start to see some true conversion vans, vehicles that run on veggie oil instead of diesel. Then we will see some converted homes fueled by renewable energy, and laundry machines powered by stationary bicycles, and toilets flushed with dirty sink water. Then we will see tears converted to laughter as people beat their swords into plowshares and weld their machine guns into saxophones, and as police officers use their billy clubs to play baseball. For even if the whole world believed in resurrection, little would change until we begin to practice it. We can believe in CPR, but people will remain dead until someone breathes new life into them. And we can tell the world that there is life after death, but the world really seems to be wondering if there is a life before death. There is some kind of conversion that happens to people not because of how we talk, but because of how we live. And our little experiments in truth become the school of conversion, where people can learn what it means for the old life is to be gone and the new life is to be upon us, no longer taking the broad path that leads to destruction. Conversion is not an event, but a process of slowly tearing ourselves from the church of culture, from the clutches of culture. Not just good Samaritans. As we practice hospitality, there comes a point where the suffering around us drives us to ask what it would take to reimagine the world. We've all heard the saying, give someone a fish and they'll eat for a day, but teach them to fish and they'll eat for the rest of their life. But our friend John Perkins challenges us to go further. He says the problem is that nobody is asking who owns the pond. As we consider economics, some of us will give people fish, others will teach people to fish, but still others will be looking at who owns the pond and who polluted it. For these are our essential questions for our survival. We must storm the fence that everyone has built around the pond and make sure everyone can get to it, for there is enough fish for all of us. A homeless mother once told us that there is a big difference between managing poverty and ending poverty. Managing poverty is big business. Ending poverty is revolutionary. Too often the church has chaplained the corporate global economy, caring for the victims of the systems as long as we are uncritically manage the collateral damage of the market economy. The world can continue to produce victims, but as Dietrich Bonhoeffer said during the Age of Injustice, we are not to simply bandage the wounds of victim beneath the wheels of injustice, but we are to drive a spoke into the wheel itself. It's like in community when the toilet floods, which happens when you have a dozen people sharing one toilet. When it starts to pour out water, you don't just start cleaning the mess. You also have to shut off the water that is causing the flood. That's the sort of thing that requires working together and the humility of admitting that that we can do together what we cannot do alone. When what we did so poorly at helping folks recover from the drug addiction, we stepped back and said, duh, no wonder none of us are heroin addicts. So we have surrounded ourselves with friends who have had so much to teach us. Alone we see only in part, but together, as the Bible says, love is made complete among us. 1 John 4:17. One of our sister communities here in Philly in New Jerusalem, which is made up of people recovering from addictions of drug and alcohol. They have taught us so much about drug addiction as well as our own addictions and recovery. They have taught us that we cannot look at the sick without looking at what is causing the sickness, that sin is both personal and social. They teach about the politics of drugs and the complexity of the drug industry. People are poor not just because of their sins, they are poor because of our sins. And people are rich because of our sins. On the wall of New Jerusalem is a sign that reads, we cannot fully recover until we help the society that made us sick recover. When you see so many of your friends waste away in drug addiction, you start to ask where the drugs are coming from. And it's not just from kids on the corner. When we are staring in the face of the largest prison buildup in history civilization, with 2 million citizens in prison and 1 in every 3 black men under judicial constraint, we start to wonder what the 13th Amendment is if slavery is illegal unless a person is convicted of a crime. When we are trying to teach kids not to hit each other and they see a government use violence to bring about change, we start to consider what it means to give witness, to preach, to witness to a peace that is not like the world gives. John 14:27. When we live in the wreckage of an old industrial neighborhood that has lost over 200,000 jobs and now has 700 abandoned factories, we start to ask questions about the corporate global economy, especially when we see the same companies abuse other neighbors overseas. Dr. Martin Luther King puts it like this: we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but one day we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that the system produces beggars' needs to be repaved. We are also called to be the Good Samaritan. But after you lift up so many people out of the ditch, you start to ask, maybe the whole road to Jericho needs to be repaved.